got to know Megan as a result of a review she wrote of a book that I wrote, which was far nicer than it needed to be. So I sent her a note saying, wow, thanks. And she sent a note back saying, let's do a book on Tom Petty. And so we did. While I have never met her in person, she has become a regular writing partner of mine, and I'm amazed at Megan's output. I think I have 10 of her books here in the house, and people have been pawing through them this past week while she's been in residence, sort of. Megan would have been here this past week in residence at the AIPCT had it not been for COVID. And we missed the fellowship, but we got the lectures anyway. So that's, I mean, it's not a total loss. In fact, it's not a loss at all, because the lectures are being recorded for posterity. So anyway, and I want to thank Troy Brown for the technical assistance and the great job that he always does on our recordings. So Megan teaches at Kennesaw State University, and she contracts, and for many years she was a high school teacher in the Atlanta area, and has won tons of awards for her books and her teaching, and is an all-around extremely cool person. Makes me wonder how long that can be sustained, because she turned 40 this past year, and you know, Henry Winkler was cool into his 50s, I suppose. So we'll see how long this lasts. But her topic today is normativity in the 90s. And she's going to talk about, I've looked him up, and I know Myron looked him up, Pierre Schlag, a legal scholar and critic who I had not encountered before, but I'm excited to hear what the notes are of the future of Pierre Schlag's critique of normativity in the 90s. All right, with that said, welcome, Megan Volpert.
Thanks as always, good sir. Okay, let's get to it, huh? Normativity in the 90s. Notes toward future applications of Pierre Schlag's critique. This lecture aims to do three things for the purpose of creating conditions under which the critique of normativity that was developed by University of Colorado at Boulder law professor Pierre Schlag throughout the 1990s might see a resurgence of interest. First, it will describe the original critique through a survey of Schlag's literature. Two, it will suggest avenues for a genealogy that traces the influence of this critique from its debut to the present day. And third, it will offer contemporary and future possibilities for the ongoing application of the critique. I want to state from the outset that this lecture marks an opening volley and not an end. It lays the groundwork for a full-length book project that I have been declaring I would write since I was a teenager. Yes, I was reading these intensely existentialist law review articles when I was in high school and as well as in college. And this is because I was captain of a nationally competitive policy debate team, which is an essential consideration of this book project. Schlag's critique was a niche argument among his peers, but it was also avidly deployed by a younger generation of nerdy debate people like myself who found our own niche in part with it. Therefore, the book is meant not only to take stock of Schlag's contribution to the field of legal studies, but also to narrate Schlag's adoption into the weird world of debaters. The critique of normativity became part of our intellectual DNA in the 90s, and then we grew up and we got jobs. We are entering middle age now and carrying forward the residue of our teenage encounters with Schlag's work in a variety of different ways. We are the lawyers, the policymakers, the professors now. We are inside the systems we criticized now. But it does seem that everyone is nostalgic for 90s revivals lately, and we want to seize upon the good fit of this chronometric avenue for our inquiry. I say we because this lecture is indebted to two people. One is my co-author for the book project, Dr. Jairus Grove. Jairus serves as director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, and he is also an assistant professor in political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He was 2 years ahead of me in school, and we became friends through our mutual love of Schlag's critique as we faced each other in competition many times. The other person who deserves our utmost thanks for this lecture is Pierre Schlag himself. Jairus and I have had a few preliminary conversations with Pierre, and he has generously agreed to support us in this book project through the provision of archival materials as well as new interviews so that we may offer some fresh insights into the critique of normativity that may genuinely advance it. The three parts of this lecture correspond to the three sections that Jairus and I intend for the book project. Part one, the critique of normativity. We begin with a review of Schlag's published works during the 1990s. This amounts to 21 law review articles and 3 books. Among the law reviews, there are 6 journals that published him more than once during the decade, 3 at his home school of Colorado, then 2 each at Cardozo, Pennsylvania, Harvard, California, and Michigan. The remaining 8 articles are one-offs at Stanford, Texas, Yale, and others. NYU Press published a collection of some of these articles in 1996. 2 books of original writing were published by Duke in 1996 and 1998. The total of these 24 publications present various facets of the critique, but Schlag did not develop the critique in a linear way where it would be of use to summarize each publication chronologically as a demonstration of his intellectual growth. The critique will be clearest if review of the literature is organized around its recurring central themes, just as we did on the debate team when we focused on the argument and then cited our best sources where useful. Stated as briefly as possible, the argument is this: the law is absurd because its reliance on reason comes with blind spots that perpetuate aesthetic and ethical prejudices, resulting in a manipulative rationalism that has created chaos and violence across disciplines that use or study the law. Normativity simply refers to the cornucopia of rationalizations that justify rational thinking. By formulating it thus, the tautological nature of the lawyerly way of being should be instantly apparent. To critique normativity is an attempt to police the police or judge the judges. It is an often humorous, sometimes terrifying experiment in precarity because it involves Schlag poking holes in the very life raft on which he is floating. The critique's 3 main themes are the field of pain and death, the problem of the subject, and an empty ontology. We'll discuss them in that order, although they are each independent enough that the order in which we discuss them does not especially matter. So let us turn to the field of pain and death. A court is a game board with a certain set of rules. Any given case that comes before the court presents a series of harms and argues for how these harms should be resolved. These harms are the pieces of pain and death that we move around the board, and our debate about them, we presume we are outside the board, solving for the pieces upon them. These pieces of pain and death are dehumanized real people, and we demean them into the utility of bare life. Solvency for the harms presented is not possible because it is the nature of our lawyering game to produce pain and death until infinity just so we can keep lawyering. As long as the field continues to manufacture pain and death, the existence of all the players at court remains justified. Quote, all this self-congratulation works very nicely so long as normative legal thought continues to imagine itself as outside the field of pain and death and as having effects within that field, Schlag says in one of the earliest articles, Normative and Nowhere to Go, in 1990. He goes on to say, quote, it is doubtful this image can be maintained. It is not so much the case that normative legal thought has effects on the field of pain and death, at least not in the direct originary way it imagines. Rather, it is more the case that normative legal thought is the pattern, is the operation of the bureaucratic distribution and the institutional allocation of the pain and the death. And apart from the leftover, ego-centered, rationalist rhetoric of 18th century and our routine, there is nothing at this point to suggest that we as legal thinkers are in control of normative legal thought, end quote. He diagnoses this picture of normative bureaucracy as boring, very, very boring, and understands that this boredom is a key symptom of the solipsism that perpetuates the system's justification of its own existence. The second central theme is the problem of the subject. This is about the bureaucrat who polices the game board. This is a player who does not exist. There is no rational, liberal, humanist, autonomous, objective, sovereign, legal subject. One scary implication is that if there is no bureaucrat, then the machinery of the court is running amok pretty much all by itself, and solving for the harms therefore becomes impossible because we are not in charge, and actually no one is in charge. Schlag develops this position in 2 articles from 1991. In the article, Normativity and the Politics of Form, he formulates this in a way that especially resonated with those of us on the debate team, saying that, quote, the adversarial advocacy orientation of normative legal thought, which is attributable, at least in part, to the conflation of the role of lawyer and legal academic, does much to insulate the sovereign individual subject and its rhetorical supports from scrutiny. Because so many legal academics understand their legal thought to be positional in character on behalf of some intangible, often very worthy, but poorly identified client surrogate, much of legal thought is produced within the explicit context of adversarial advocacy among academics and is devoted to advancing or defeating this or that position. Many normative legal thinkers understand themselves to be engaged in passionate advocacy on behalf of some cause. Now, admittedly, there is no tribunal listening. No one is empowered to put all this normative passion into effect, but this does not mean that this passionate advocacy is therefore without effect. On the contrary, it often succeeds in bracketing any serious questioning of the rhetorical systems that enable such aimless, passionate advocacy to be produced in the first place. Indeed, when one is engaged in passionate arguments to an imagined tribunal, the last thing one will do is question the argumentative structures that allow the arguments to be framed and presented in the first place, end quote. In the article, The Problem of Subject, he then concludes, quote, as legal thinkers, we like to think we are doing good, normative legal work, advancing noble causes and the like. But if the liberal subject is no longer operating the levers and our work product can take on a different character, we may simply be rehearsing and reproducing the instrumentalist logic of bureaucratic practices. Indeed, the main significance of noble normative work is in the rehearsal of a false aesthetic of social life, one which falsely represents instrumentalist strategies as within the control of individual subjects, the unfolding of bureaucratic logic as the choices of individuals, and the discursive mechanisms of coercion as normative dialogue, end quote. It is tempting then to point beyond the lawyers to the judge, but to lean on this bureaucrat raises the specter of social control and statism. Schlag takes aim at judges in his 1993 article, Clerks in the Maze, which focuses on the violence that is done by judging. Judges inflict consequences like incarceration or the death penalty. Moreover, picking winners and losers at court is a monist maneuver that kills off other conceptualizations of the law in service to one precedent or obligation or whatever it is that's being declared the winning argument of a particular case. There are two ways of validating the judgment of judges to avoid confronting this violence. One is to constrain and control them, about which Schlag says, quote, the attitude of this legal thinker is that of a sculptor working cautiously and carefully on the monument of the law. He dare not have a creative idea, certainly not a big idea, lest it chip or crack the monument of the law in an irretrievable manner. The attitude is one of self-abnegation. Ironically, despite the constricted form of thought produced through this legitimation strategy of constraint and control, there's one aspect in which it knows no limits, no restraint at all. That is in the unfettered attempt to dissect and differentiate its own minute contributions to the edifice of the law into even tinier analytical pieces, end quote. The other strategy is to justify and redeem, about which Schlag says, quote, the perennial focus of legal thinkers on justification, on the offering of reasons, and on the formulation of normative prescriptions is an attempt to rationalize the violence of the law of judges by limiting its use to the achievement of good, widely shared ends. Similarly, the fascination with the question, what should the law be? And the fascination with the constant advocacy of goodness, rightness, and justice are also attempts to ensure that there is never a moment when the normative validity or ethical identity of law might actually be in serious question, end quote. He concludes that, quote, like the constraint and control strategy, then, there is also one way in which the justify and redeem strategy knows no limit. It has an absolute and absolutely remarkable faith in the use and the usefulness of law and legal argument for the achievement of the good, the just, the right, and so on, end quote. This brings us to the third central theme of an empty ontology. The machinery of the court, or the debate round, has no intelligence either. When we refer to justice or truth or rights, we are not talking about things with substance. If these object forms we create to prop up our adversarial advocacies are an illusion, the rule of law is itself an illusion. One implication here is that we cannot bargain down into any calls for piecemeal or pragmatic solutioning. These are bogus because there is no quote unquote practical system existing. And so bargaining is really just the continued co-option of these originary inquiries by asking that they be deferred yet again to empty procedural frameworks. Another implication is that this bankrupt way of being lawyerly is a cover-up for the violence of the legal machine. Again, from Clerks in the Maze, quote, this fascination with moral totems is inscribed everywhere, from sophisticated expression in the philosophical theories of moralist thinkers like Ronald Dworkin to the mundane practice of policy and principle justification in judicial opinions, to the idolatrous worship of sacred signifiers like the Constitution, rights, progressive, or even transformative action among legal academics. It is inscribed in the very aesthetic structure of the usual law review narrative, which typically proceeds in a cheerful progression from inefficiency to efficiency, iniquity to goodness, oppression to liberation, or to put it in generic terms, from insuperable illegitimacy to general moral wonderfulness. This moralizing tendency is inscribed as well in the political intellectual syndicalism that organize and regulates faction fights on faculties, hiring decisions, and the like, end quote. In his article Hiding the Ball in 1996, Schlag invokes the story of the 6 blind people and the elephant to make his argument in a different way. Most of us know some version of this little allegory in which all the blind people feel a different part of the elephant, and so each has a different interpretation of what an elephant is depending on their individual perception. If we characterize the law like this elephant, this allegory soothes us with the belief that each conflicting account of the meaning of the law or the doctrine or the Constitution is at least partly right. In the allegory, the audience are not blind and we can see the whole elephant, but in law, we are asserting an elephant nobody has seen. Schlag says that, quote, the possibility that the master reference are ontologically deficient is precisely the sort of insight that can put the discipline of law into question. It's one thing to confront the possibility that the Constitution is too many things at once. It's quite another to suggest that it isn't much of anything at all, end quote. In the article, and throughout his 1998 book, The Enchantment of Reason, Schlag draws an analogy between law and religion. The law cannot afford ontological questions, so it sticks narrowly to technical, normative, or occasionally epistemic questions. The bottom line is that we can criticize the way a lawyer or a judge does their work, but there is a prohibition on critique of the law itself. The religious parallel is that when believers lose faith in the work being done by the church, they can still take solace in their gods. But if the gods are themselves wrong or corrupt or bankrupt or non, then that is a true crisis of faith that cannot be remedied by swapping out an awful priest or doing more careful bookkeeping. So we mysticize the law and we fetishize its reasoning in order to gloss the ontological bankruptcies of it as a field. Okay, what then should we do about all this? That's the challenge that we face at the rock bottom of normativity. The critique points to a challenging aspect of our lives and we instinctively attempt to immediately solve it. Answering this discursive reflex eclipses a fundamentally more basic consideration of whether we can do anything at all. Weighing what is better or worse to do about normativity always already presupposes us back into the main vein, where we can sort out pain and death because there's no problem of subject, and these object forms of justice or truth, they really do exist. We cannot ask what we should do. Yet simultaneously, we cannot really prohibit the asking because that is also caught up in the normative impulse to prescribe solutions. For debaters, this was a particular problem. We used this critique to win competitions. Yet in asking the judge to vote for us, we fell into the traps of normativity just as surely as our opponents did in presenting their own case. The argument that most often defeated our critique were those instinctive, fearful kinds, asking judges, please don't shoot yourselves in the foot. We were accused of performative contradiction, which was presumed to be bad because coherency was presumed to be good. We were told to be more pragmatic, to gather some breathing space from our theory guilt, never asking who this pragmatist subject is in the first place. Our opponents claimed that the cases they presented also criticized some portion of the law, so it didn't matter if they reinforced the entire general discipline that was giving birth to the status quo. They defended their good intentions or their good rhetoric or their good performance. They said Schlag's critique was only regarding the law and we were policymakers, not lawyers, so debate was the wrong forum for this critique. Okay, if they were super sad about it, our opponents threw up their hands and said there was no alternative to normativity, so there was no reason to vote for it. If they were super mad about it, they just called us nihilists. It is difficult to imagine a better way of perpetrating the feedback loop of normative justifications than literally making it a game for students to play, whereby if you win enough ballots, you are showered with trophies and scholarship money. And in the end, whether we won or lost usually depended most on the individual predisposition of the judge to either keep on trucking through endless rounds of legal and political jockeying at endless tournaments, or press pause long enough to enjoy entertaining some radical questioning about our beloved academic competition for a couple of hours. So that even when we lost 100% of the time, it offered very fine proof that Schlag was onto something. And maybe some of us had started out using the critique just to win, as we would any other argument, but eventually our experience with wielding the critique of normativity began to affect our worldview. Part 2, genealogy. If much of what I said in part 1 sounds eerily Foucauldian, this part will make the link explicit. Moreover, I had literally not even heard of Foucault until I ran across references to him in the work of Schlag. And this mode of influence is central both to my personal story and to the history of this critique. In his 1998 book, Enchantment of Reason, Schlag lists Foucault among several other continental critics of reason, including the usual suspects like Nietzsche, Derrida, and Deleuze. This particular citation occurs within a chapter on the predicaments of reason in a subsection devoted to analyzing problems with critical reflexivity, chief among which is that we have no access to the unthought unless it is mediated by our social construction of reason. Quote, the unthought, says Schlag, will always already be apprehended from within the matrices, the grammar, the orientation of a particular thinking grounded in its own unthought, end quote. He then proceeds to quickly enumerate the most iconic variations on the names of the unthought. Quote, will to power, Nietzsche, forms of life, Wittgenstein, the unconscious, Freud, the hermeneutic circle, Gadamer, the project, Sartre, power knowledge, Foucault, interpretive communities, Fish, de France, Derrida, habitus, Bourdieu, the background, Searle, the plane, Deleuze-Guattari, and so on, end quote. This is an incredible reading list to give to a teenager or to a PhD student in philosophy for that matter. Looking back on Schlag's publications at a distance of 20 years since I last had even minor involvement in the debate community, I can see with crystal clarity that the Critique of Normativity is the gateway drug. It did indeed provide the framework and the language upon which a small society of debaters constructed our beliefs. As such, we can try to do with Schlag what Schlag tried to do with reason. That is, offer a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense, tracing the impact of Schlag's work upon a few branches of the debate community's family tree. How many scholars other than me were introduced to Foucault and to theory generally through the work of Schlag? We may actually have learned about norms associated with the world of working adults due to Schlag's critique of them. What became of these debaters once they began adulting, both ideologically and in their career fields? So the purpose of part 2 of the book is to tell the stories of debaters, as well as Schlag himself, covering the duration of his critiques through our community in the 1990s up through about 2003, where the trail gets cold. We've already been making our list of who to contact about doing an interview, and we hope that the large number of interviews required for this project will help us accomplish something that can be construed as reasonably comprehensive. For Jairus and me, the list of interviewees includes our high school and college coaching staff, key figures at the summer debate institutes we attended, our friends from other debate programs who were similarly captivated, either positively or negatively, by the critique, as well as the judges who had to listen to our arguments. My list of interviewees primarily comes from the Midwest, especially from Illinois and Michigan. Jairus's list primarily comes from the South, especially Texas, but he also spent summers at the Dartmouth Debate Institute that covers much of the East Coast. Both our lists include interviewees from the West Coast, as, believe it or not, our California friends were often the most intellectually receptive to these kinds of critiques. Not to get too prescriptive or predictive about it, but we can admit to harboring an expectation for such a genealogy to show that the proliferation of ideas from the critique was not rationally inevitable, but rather was the result of the contingent turns of history between a bunch of us who will be interviewed. Even in scratching the surface, we have already encountered some wild areas of overlap or common influence. My favorite at the moment is that the origin point for introducing the debate community to Schlag's work appears to have been a 1994 or 1995 Dartmouth file, entirely researched using a LexisNexis password that Rebecca Tushnet stole from her father, Mark Tushnet, the renowned critical legal studies professor at Harvard, who also happened to write one of Schlag's tenure letters and helped him publish one of his law review articles, despite his personally vehement dislike for the Critique of Normativity. Schlag's own list of interviewees will likely yield other similar markers and overlaps of influence. He finished undergraduate work in philosophy at Yale in 1975, then law school at UCLA in 1978. He joined a Washington, D.C. firm where he did pro bono work in addition to antitrust and tax law until he became a law professor at the University of Puget Sound in 1982. He was there until he took a position at Colorado in 1989, where he has been ever since. Schlag has given us a list of his close friends familiar with both his life and work, plus the names of his most serious and charitable critics. We can also trace those interested in the Critique of Normativity through the law review editors who saw fit to publish his articles about it. Alas, we have already determined that Schlag was not in communication with any critical race theory scholars who also were becoming popular in the 90s, nor did he have any contact with feminist scholar Judith Butler, though he did have one lunch with Derrida at Cardozo's first conference on deconstruction. As with any oral history project, there is the fundamental question of structure or formatting to consider. Beyond crafting these two parallel tracks of the debate community and Schlag's own life, our current instinct is not to attempt to weave all the quotations together into a singular master narrative, nor to attempt to synthesize or smooth conflicting viewpoints on the critique. We would rather find a method for arranging them that lets the quotation largely speak for themselves, something akin to the model provided by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain's wonderful and legendary 1996 genealogy, Please Kill Me, an Oral History of Punk Rock. It's one thing to examine the intellectual spaces in which Schlag and all these debate nerds strung themselves together, but we are also very interested in the 90s as a time frame for these activities. How is the critique of normativity sprung uniquely from the situation of the 1990s? How does it tell our coming of age story as children of the 90s? Schlag's own coming of age is situated squarely in 1968 when Schlag was 14. Joan Didion once said something about how all of the 60s took place in 1968, and Schlag's politics and psychology were certainly informed by that year. Again, the interviews will reveal whatever they reveal, and we don't want to predetermine or rush a conclusion of the temporal dimension of this inquiry, but we have feelings. We have feelings that the critique of normativity is related to the musical genre of grunge. Yes, perhaps all roads do lead to the band Nirvana. The 90s were a time when progressives were losing the culture wars, institutions were not friendly, people wanted to find new ways of doing stuff because nothing was working. Schlag was teaching at Puget Sound from 82 to 89 and getting a big whiff of anarchist movements in Seattle. Nirvana was already hugely definitive on the Seattle scene, and Sub Pop released the band's first album in the summer of '89, just as Schlag was packing up for Colorado. We asked Schlag what else he was listening to as he began work on the critique of normativity, and he immediately cited the Talking Heads. And eventually, he flipped through his CD collection and playlists to give us a roster of the bands that inspired him. The angst and introspection about his role in the legal academy, combined with the overall disappointments of the 90s, made Schlag something outsider, which we debate nerds who also very much felt this way could certainly sense in his writing. Perhaps this is the basis of our intellectual kinship for what drew us to his often hilarious writing style and the punkish attitude of his critique. He could sense the deadness of the academy and offered tidbits like these in his personal correspondence with us. I recall feeling a need to jumpstart legal thought. The absence of mentors helps explain my scholarly trajectory because I was pretty much on my own with no one to rein me in. I wanted to strike out on my own, and there was really no one in my immediate entourage who would be able to help me. Schlag was looking for a way to survive within these institutions that didn't force him to take part in their dead forms. He was searching for something that felt more originary, to slough off the grungy malaise, which may also turn out to be the key to how we look toward a future for this critique. Part 3, futurity. In reflecting on how the critique of normativity was received during the 1990s, one of the funniest things Schlag told us in his personal correspondence was, quote, "Note that I never said don't be normative. I was interpreted that way, largely because I was read, wait for it, normatively," end quote. He gets it. So do we. It is an obvious point that there is still no solutioning to do here. If the critique of normativity offers an originary reflection on the inescapable ontological trappings of civilized life, then one thing we can do in part 3 of this book project is show how normativity continues to pervade by updating the timeline of the critique without prescribing any remedy for normativity itself. When people look back on the 90s now, it is common to suggest that the 90s were the end of something. In theoretical terms, the 90s gave birth to postmodernity. Since then, we have had second or third wave postmodernism or post-postmodernity, or we have tacked late onto capitalism and other systems. But these all still just fidget around with the fundamental dilemmas of postmodernity. And in some sense, Schlag's critique was simply saying that the law struggles to admit postmodernism. We can certainly still say that today. So the main purpose of part 3 of the book is to say that, as well as to tell how the critique broadly applies to areas of practice in all fields of life that greatly overlap with the law. As an ongoing consideration for legal studies, while the law continues to struggle to admit postmodernism, its offensive and defensive use of normativity to combat the creep of postmodernity is failing in increasingly very obvious ways. So much so that it is tempting to speak of the cultural logics of late normativity, just as we speak of the cultural logics of late capitalism. We have begun to experience the consequences of what we might call late normativity in the unveiling of the powerlessness of the liberal left as norms fail to protect us. Consider the glaring example of the Supreme Court's 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision. The case was decided by a 6-3 vote, with 5 of those justices joining the opinion that Dobbs effectively overturned 50 years of precedents applied by Roe v. Wade and backed by Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Of these 5 justices, 4 of them had previously stated during their Senate confirmation hearings, albeit not under oath, that they consider Roe to be settled precedent. So, are these 4 justices liars? And if so, so what? The Supreme Court has no code of ethics. The justices have sworn to protect the Constitution, a document full of warm, fuzzy object forms that we have already posited may be empty. For a less specific example, what we can broadly call Trump Nation, the current elephant in the room with 6 allegorical blind people, Schlag himself is working on a book on this, Twilight of the American State, forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press in 2023. From the publicity materials, quote, "Viewed as a legal matter, the American state is not just a liberal democracy as most Americans believe. Rather, the American state is composed of an uneasy and unstable combination of different versions of the state: liberal democratic, administered, neoliberal, and dissociative. Each of these versions arose through its own law and legal institutions. Each emerged at a different time in history. Each was prompted by deficits in the prior versions. Each has survived displacement by succeeding versions. All remain active in the contemporary moment, creating a political legal dysfunction that America confronts today," end quote. Schlag plans to map out, quote, "a big picture view of the tribulations of the American state. The book abjures conventional academic frameworks, sterile, sets aside prescriptions for quick fixes, won't work, dispenses with lamentations about polarization, whistling in the wind, and bypasses historical celebrations of the American spirit, useless sentimentalism," end quote. To whatever extent the law has admitted postmodernism, the result has been our current dissociative state. Trump may go to prison for life, or he may be elected again to the presidency and decide he wants to hold that office for life. Both of these outcomes are both equally plausible and equally fantastical, which speaks to our dissociative state. The ironies of our predicament yield feelings of disconnection that do seem very at home in the ambivalent psychology of the 1990s. Beyond legal studies and further ramifications for the state, we can examine smaller case studies of emergent fields of normativity that proceed from the law, which could be really found most anywhere, from academic fields to the grassroots culture wars and even commercial popular culture. In popular culture, the holes poked in normative thinking produce viral disruptions on social media. The very portable format of a meme itself resembles the bankrupt object forms of justice and truth within the law. A sudden circulation of and momentary widespread obsession over any specific meme runs parallel to the passionate advocacy of a single court case, tried instead in the court of public opinion, with social media accounts for judges rendering the verdict in comments, likes, shares, and follows. This is big data's world now, and the rest of us just live inside its algorithm. Perhaps the average sitting senator does not have any passable comprehension of what the internet is, but the Critique of Normativity appears to provide some semblance of a bureaucratic systems theory for the digital age. In the academic field of media studies, as well as for journalists with boots on the ground, the current hot topic in ethics is how to overcome the many-headed hydra of fake news. It used to be easy to believe in the objective nature of news reporting, and whatever challenges of that may have been, this broad public distrust in the truth of any given news broadcast now is symptomatic of a breakdown in normativity. Moreover, a number of news networks and individual commentators have begun capitalizing on this public skepticism so blatantly that the distrust has given way to apathy, wherein the news has become more like background music in an elevator. Its purpose is no longer understood to be information or even entertainment. The news moves pieces of pain and death around the game board, and even the accusation that a particular bit of news is fake does nothing to impede the circulation of that bit of news. Other topics for consideration here might be the 24-hour news cycle, as well as the rise of televised trials like Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, to arbitration-based reality shows like Judge Judy or The People's Court. The culture wars of the 1990s have begun to heat up again in general. The fight over abortion will be reinvigorated thanks to the Dobbs decision. The daily updated tally of mass shootings and the movement to end gun violence has finally created enough pressure for Congress to pass the first gun safety legislation in 30 years since the Brady Bill in 1993. Privacy concerns abound in the newly rigorous efficiency of the surveillance state. Brutality concerns continue to abound in the Black Lives Matter movement, leading to deeper questioning about who watches the watchers, who polices the police. There is a patchwork of conflicting medical and recreational cannabis regulations and penalties as one travels from state line to state line. Separation of church and state is again at issue in the debates over public school voucher funding and prayer in schools. Schools have also been the proving ground for arguments about transgender identity politics and a revived suspicion of critical race theory. Petitions to ban books read in public schools are on the rise, as are challenges to intellectual freedom of academics who publish controversial scholarship. All of this is very 90s. There's even a new Beavis and Butthead movie. The world we live in today seems to be experiencing the ongoing slow motion crash of normativity that Schlag was critiquing. It turns out that he was right about a lot of things, but perhaps the title of his 1990 article, Normative and Nowhere to Go, was not quite one of those things. Time kept ticking. Those of us raised on normativity in the 90s grew up. We all went somewhere, albeit probably in a circular manner. And at the end of that article, Schlag says, quote, "From the perspective of normative legal thought, either the crash does not exist, or if it does, it is simply an unaccountable, inexplicable intellectual and cultural catastrophe. Indeed, in static terms, the existing categories, the existing grammar of normative legal thought are utterly incapable of providing any sort of sophisticated account for the crash," end quote. I hope that this lecture and the book project that it describes demonstrate that our modern catastrophe is not altogether inexplicable, even when it is not solvable. Perhaps now that we debate nerds are adults living in the world instead of teenagers mostly just reading about it, the grammar of our normative legal thought has undergone a shift dynamic enough to warrant revisiting Schlag's critique to provide some account of our current crash. I make no claims that glory in the sophistication of renewing our interest in giving this account, but I do vouch for its attitude, because I believe, despite all our success at getting inside of these fields of normativity, Jairus, Pierre, and me agree, we still feel like outsiders.
Thank you, Megan. That was most entertaining,
Good.
as well as enlightening and informative. So I'm sure that there are comments and questions. Robert.
Yeah, I would just say that I'm overwhelmed.
Sorry.
I expect it's good.
Well, it was like a drink from a fire hose.
I am a fast talker even when I'm sick.
You might say that again, yes.
Did you, Megan, did you do the kind of debate where you talk super fast?
Yes.
Okay, I was just wondering. That's I always found that to be a kind of a strange, self-undermining form of performance because I can't follow it that fast. But anyway, Robert, you had a question.
No, I didn't have a question. It was just a response, just an overwhelming feeling of being overwhelmed and actually recognizing some of what you said, Megan, in my own life, observations that I've made, and feeling validated for that. Yeah, my general feeling is it would take a long time for me to process this 33.
I, for one, I can't wait for the book. I mean, yeah. I'm excited about this book. So we've got another one to finish first, but so I had the same feeling, Robert, that of just moments of recognition from my own life and the life of people I know, and about how I've always tended to sort of reach back to Charles Dickens' Bleak House for an understanding of where this came from, because he was sort of the Pierre Schlag of 1860, in the sense that particular novel is a really all-encompassing critique of the English legal system, and it sounds a lot like what Schlag is doing, because not only do you sort of lose your bearings, but you can't see how it could possibly have a future. And sometimes I wonder if Dickens writing about it didn't end up making a big difference to the reforms that were introduced during his lifetime. Queen Victoria's reforming sort of move, because you would inherit a lawsuit through generations in the English legal system, and it was clearly constructed only to serve bureaucrats and lawyers. Meanwhile, it impoverished both the society and undermined the legitimacy of the institutions that were supposed to be making decisions. And so that's the way that Bleak House unfolds. And that had always been my point of reference, but now I think I have a new one, because 90s sort of, it's not really nihilism, but 90s. How would you refer to that miasma or the sort of feeling of the 90s that nothing makes any difference? What's a good word for that? Nihilism is too strong.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's a debate in part about whether the 90s truly was invested in apathy or whether there was an ambivalence there. And I think that I am more in the ambivalence camp. I mean, this is a question of two different types of dualism, ultimately, that we're bickering about, right? So it's a narcissism of minor differences, if you will, probably ultimately. But when people talk about the apathy of the 90s, the coolness of the apathy of the 90s, what they're missing is how much anxiety contributed to the need to be and perform apathy, right? And so I mean, if you're worried so much about whether you're worried too much, right, the tautological nature of that apathy makes clear that it's not just one feeling, it's actually that feedback loop of feelings, and so the people that say it's apathetic, I think, are missing a lot of the psychological undercurrent there, and just accepting at face value that what everybody said about how they didn't care was the truth of how they felt. And I don't think that it was. I think that it was a time of confusion where you felt both strongly positively and strongly negatively, or maybe you felt strongly negatively but utterly helpless to do anything about it, right? And so I'm more of I describe it as ambivalence, because I think pointing to a two-feeling duality is more valuable than pointing to a one-feeling flatness of apathy while ignoring the dualistic nature of apathy. But I think ultimately what we're talking about is a series of feelings that create a feedback loop that was perhaps destructive.
Myron seems to have a point to make.
I wanted to ask if you have read the philosopher and cultural critic Chuck Klosterman's new book, The 90s.
Yeah.
That was going to be my question too. Yeah.
Everything you're saying sounds like it's
Look,
coming straight out of what he actually said. I just finished it a few months ago, but I believe his term for it is indifference.
Yeah, and I think that's wrong.
Indifference.
Yeah, and I think that's wrong. And I wrote a review that said so, and he and I have gone several rounds about it.
Oh, okay. Well, but it sounds like everything you just said, though, does not disagree with what he says in his book about the sentiments that the 90s stirred in this kind of complacency.
Yeah, we agree on a lot of the facts.
Semantics.
We agree on a lot of the facts, but because Chuck is, I don't know, like 8 years older than me, he was already in his 20s in the 90s, whereas I was 14, 15, I graduated high school in 1999. And so
did I. We're the same age.
Sweet.
So
okay,
check it out. You'll appreciate this. Beyond Chuck Klosterman, I'm sure you've read the book. That's good. And I like the telephone on the cover because my grandma used to have one of those. But there's research that's just recently been done by The Atlantic, by NPR, that shows that many of the popular artists today, especially in terms of music and in the genre of movie cinema, many of the themes from the 90s are showing up or being rehashed, re-entangled. And so I think there's a lot of entertainment, pop culture, rituals, and works that are looking to the 90s as a mode of creativity, or at least as a mode of commodification, if you want to be more cynical.
Yeah.
Titanic, Nirvana, the list goes on and on.
I mean, my wife and I just watched the new Beavis and Butthead movie the other day, Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe. And the premise of it is the same as every episode of the show and the movies that were made in the 90s, which is these two morons are constantly, through no fault or strategy of their own, no intelligence of their own whatsoever, are proceeding through all these institutions that are supposed to be secure and run by reasonable adults with judicious and rational intentions, and they make it all the way into outer space and nearly destroy the entire cosmos and the time-space continuum through no fault of their own and no strategy of their own. And they luck into it and they luck out of it, all because adults are continuing to operate on the basis of these norms, which for some reason they have, Beavis and Butthead have just woven themselves through accidentally, just in their quest for infinite double entendres and sexual puns, which is all they care about because they're kids, but somehow they make it in and almost destroy the world, and they make it out and everything's fine. You know what I mean? But the reason for that is actually related to Dickens. The reason for that is tied to all of Victorian literature, is very good at showing how children understand that the world of adults is no wiser, no better, no smarter, no more rational, just as violent, perhaps even more so than the world of children. So that, I think, is something that it does very much have in common. The connection between the Victorians and the 90s makes a lot of sense to me, although it's been a long time since I looked at Bleak House. But
looks like Courtney has a contribution here. Go ahead.
And excuse me, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Oh gosh, yes.
Same deal, very much so.
Premise, pretty much. Yeah.
Well, Klosterman
So
really speaks to me, and I've read everything he's written, except I haven't gotten to the 90s yet. And the thing about it is, though, is that I don't really understand his perspective, but I feel like I need to consume it in order to understand what on earth was happening in the 90s. I was stuck in Oklahoma for the whole decade, and nothing happened there. So I was vaguely aware that there was something going on in the world, but it hasn't made it to Oklahoma yet at this point. And so the 90s remains a sort of I'm like a gorilla with a big red ball. It's one of my favorite images. And here's the 90s. It's a big red ball, and I don't really know what to do with it except throw it around. It is foreign to me. I didn't know the 80s was the 80s while I was enjoying the 80s, and failed to enjoy it in the way that apparently I should have. But the 90s is just a vague, opaque something or other to me. I was in my 30s, and it was incomprehensible what was going on to me. And I hear people talking about it now, and it's making more and more sense that it's actually a thing, that something happened in the 90s. I just don't know what it was.
Well, no one at the time did. And I think that's a part of the situation, is that, no one sensed it as a historical moment. No one at the time thought it was the end of something, but everyone understood suddenly irony was a mainstream, not only concept, but phenomenon. And so how do we engage with a type of phenomenon we have never experienced? And now we reflect back, now that we've had so much experience with irony, for better and for worse, we still don't know how to integrate it into a system that is supposed to be serious. We still can't admit the types of duality that it unveils to us. You know what I mean? And so in some ways, this is still just a problem of what do we do about postmodernism when we have to get up and put our pants on and go to work every day? That's still the question, I think. And now that we are experiencing a portion of time and space that it seems to recur, now that we're experiencing what happened in the 90s seemingly again, it seems like now we're ripe to theorize about what we missed then. And in an effort to do better now, maybe.
Well, so most people knew that the 80s were the 80s, even during the 80s. I wasn't one of them, but most people did. But the 90s, for some reason, didn't have that character. I remember one of my students telling me in the mid-90s, she was very patiently explaining to me why her values were what they were. And she and her boyfriend, she said, Randy, we're hipsters. And this is what, and then like, what the hell is that? About 2010, it became clear to me what the hell that was. But at the time, it meant nothing to me. It does mean it's about the irony, but I didn't grasp
because
that.
It's a violation of apathy to justify where your apathy comes from. Apathy seems to come from nowhere, apathy seems to come from nowhere. So it's not cool to say like, I'm struggling to process how irony, irony can be really depressing. I'm struggling to process that, so I'm just not going to process it, right? And I think now,
It's still incomprehensible to me.
maybe, but I mean, that's a sign of generational difference in part, right? Because when I speak to my students, whether we're talking about the college kids or the high school kids, they have an innate understanding of the duality of all things and the stupidity of all things. You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand memes that well either. And my students constantly would be trying to explain them to me. And then I'm like, okay, when you make that argument as like a chunk of visual rhetoric, I kind of see what it's up to, but I can't get that just from looking at the image alone or knowing even like what account sent me the image or who made the image. I struggle with it. And so, that's a sign of my own 40-somethingness. That's a sign of my own middle-agedness, is that these new forms, Gen Z, the millennials, they're much more capable of, because they grew up they're native to irony. They're native to postmodernism in a way that we are not.
I have a question.
Right.
Can you speak more about duality? I mean, I understand duality as a philosophical concept, but I'd like to know more about what you mean as an applied concept.
Sure. Applied to affect, right?
Yeah.
A lot of what I'm thinking about is influenced by Lauren Berlant, the scholar of precarity, let's say. And it just to sort of clarify and restate the argument that I was making earlier, per Randy's question, apathy flattens out the idea of feeling. Apathy seems to come from nowhere, seems to have no justification or motive behind it. It just exists in a very opaque and vague manner that we often associate with feelings in the 90s. But apathy may, at its root, be produced by anxiety. The anxiety of being unable to integrate irony into one's practical daily life, the anxiety of wondering, am I cool enough? Am I displaying enough types of apathy? Am I, yes, reality bites. Am I standing firmly enough in the position that this is all meaningless and that reality just bites, And so to say that the 90s were apathetic kind of glosses what is actually a dualism, because the apathy is predicated on a certain type of anxiety. So it's those two concepts working back and forth in a feedback loop with each other. Whereas to characterize the 90s as ambivalent means that you are saying, not only did we felt strongly, but we felt pulled in opposite directions, which is more of a description of the cycle of those feelings and less a kind of, like flipping it on its side till it's flat, until it's made apathetic. So that's why I was speaking about dualism, just specifically in the psychological context of the mood of the 90s, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I have an experience to relate. I said 2010 was the year that I first understood what a hipster was. That was the year that I started playing in a band with a hipster who was simultaneously the most ironic, the most anxious, and the most apathetic person I have ever known. He shall remain nameless, but he's still a friend and a great guitar player that I play with sometimes. But watching this guy who is very much what you're describing, watching this guy try to be a hipster, knowing that anxiety was driving it, extreme anxiety of a sort I've never experienced in my life. And so I sort of felt sorry. It was like, man, this person is deeply anxious about everything. And then on the other hand, super ironic about everything. And there was very little middle left for him to negotiate. It was, he tried to perform apathy. And it's hard. It's really hard to be apathetic in that way.
Well, but is apathy a psychological defense?
Well, I think compensation. I would say that his apathy was compensation for the fact that he was skewered between being drawn extremely in two different directions. Everything's stupid or everything matters.
I think apathy is not inherently defensive, but it's a matter of the context of its use. This too comes from Lauren Berlant's work. They said that that everything is a matter of relations, even feelings. And so the affect of apathy, the affect of having no affect, right? The apathy is stemming from the fact that we're in this relation where we need to push something aside or slaughter something, that it can be offensive or defensive, but it depends relationally on the context.
Yeah, I took you to be talking about this in relation to a kind of social capital, or maybe being cool or hip and having that ability to be apathetic.
Yeah.
It's very performative.
Yeah. Judith Butler, the rise of Judith Butler throughout the 1990s, we talk about her as a gender scholar because she was more, the first people that attached themselves to the work of Judith Butler were the gender studies people,
Right.
because that was the series of examples she chose. But increasingly, Butler is writing just about power and knowledge relations, so her original niche of examples was perhaps related to gender and sexuality, the same way that Lauren Berlant's were, actually. But the two of them both, in the end, we're just talking about feelings that people have and ways people behave in the world. Now performativity or performance studies is its own category of thing, of which gender performance is just one small, obvious example that got the ball kind of rolling. In the same way, I think that normativity has much broader applications than just a critique of the legal system.
I think Les had a question, but he ran away just as the. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. Thank you for your lecture, by the way. Very good. Lots of things to think about, especially this idea of apathy and kind of performing apathy, because it seems as though performing apathy requires a certain amount of care and thought into like how well I'm going to do at being apathetic.
Yeah.
And anyway, this takes me back to I guess what my real question is. We talk about the Constitution and these frameworks and kind of how normativity, is a bad question, really, or something like that. There's nothing, it's not the answer, right? But there might be some other framework or groundwork for how we're going to make this. So what is your answer to, or do you have one that's
an alternative
to like?
No, homie, I do not.
Darn.
Look, honestly, I think that's whatever. That's the bravest thing we can say now, right? Is that to try to find a solution to this is just an inadequate question and framework and starting point for conversation, as it was when I was winning and losing debates with that against that very same claim when I was 15. The problem is asking, how can we solve all this? Like what the critique of normativity is actually about is saying, like, you guys, there's oxygen everywhere. Or like there's noxious gas everywhere. The ocean, we're already swimming in it. I can't point toward it. I'm in it all the time. It's a kind of Buddhist, or that's my personal spirituality, so I lean in that direction, but it's a very mystical sort of maneuver, I guess, ultimately. And I don't say mystical in a negative way, of course, because mysticism is all we have. Reason itself is a form of mysticism, but is so entrenched for all of us that it becomes difficult to articulate the unthought, right? That's what Schlag says.
Yeah,
but doesn't all of this conversation, everything, emanate from some basic ontology that we have agreement on?
I think you wish it did, and so do I.
What Western, let's call it Western ontology, Western Judeo-Christian, Newtonian, with Einsteinian enhancements ontology. To me, it seems like there is a basis. We may have lots of different views of that basis, but there is some basis, and I call it that, Judeo-Christian, Newtonian, Einsteinian enhancements ontology, that everything that we talk about emanates from. All of this conversation, all of our investigations, all of our opinions.
That's your belief.
It's my belief. I if it's my belief or not, but my question. Maybe I want to believe that. Maybe it helps me organize
Yeah.
Because
you got to live. You got to get up and put your pants on and go to work, right?
No, I don't.
Well, I do.
I'm retired.
You used to.
I do have to get up and put my pants on. There's no question about that. Yeah, you have to live. I mean, yes, exactly. But what's lacking is the certainty. What replaces it is the illusion of certainty that somehow comes from this belief that there is an ontology, even if I don't even say the word ontology, that there is a basis for all of the way we live in Western society. Lots of different opinions about what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate, what's not, but there is some grounding, some ground state, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the grounding is one that we have all participated in the manufacture of for hundreds of years,
right?
As you say, and so yes, there are many books that argue for those conclusions, but in the end, reason as a framework or as a particular justification for any given point is a belief system. That reason can argue our way out of things or accurately describe things enough so that we can live stable and successful lives, and even the desirability of to be stable and successful. I mean, these things are all just beliefs. And so that's not, the system that uses them views that as an attack, but a critique is not necessarily meant as an attack. It's just pointing out this is the water that we are swimming in, or this is the air that we are all breathing. Yeah. And, we cannot do anything about the fact that the oxygen is there or that the ocean is there.
I guess where I go with that is that everything is tautological. I mean, yes, the dictionary requires every word in the dictionary to explain every other word in the dictionary. Sure. So we've got this completely enclosed tautological, I'm going to call it ontology for lack of another word.
Yeah.
We're in the midst of moving around all the time, pre-modernism, modernism, postmodernism, et cetera, et cetera. The 90s for me were a blank. They were the worst decade of my life. I'm 82, by the way. So I have a lot of history. And I really related to the 60s happened in 1968, because that year shook me out of my lethargy, building a career, raising a family, all the other things, taking all of what I was just talking about for granted, that all of a sudden that wasn't for granted anymore. That wasn't the way things were. Yeah,
I think we're in agreement, but you're worried about it and I'm not worried about it.
Okay.
That's the difference. Right?
Yeah.
The situation is that regardless of my belief or your belief, and that's like in the Judeo-Christian ethic or in the logics of reason or whatever it is that's your belief or my belief, both of us are using that to create feelings in ourselves, right? And so how do we explain the origin of the feeling that was so prevalent in the 90s? And you too are kind of saying that's a terrible decade. It's a blank decade. Nothing took place, or it was terrible for me personally, right? Yeah. Or the way that you're describing 1968 as the time of epiphany, of transcendent joy, of suddenly being shaken out of your previous stupor of norms and traditions and learning that there could be something else that you could get for yourself or think about for yourself, right? So the feelings there are what we need to follow now in part, because feeling is a genuine thing that happens inside each of us that ought to be better conveyed and communicated. And we need, this is to Berlant's point, or even to Butler's points about performativity. We need ways to theorize those feelings and where they came from, which is something we never did in the 90s. We never talked about why all this apathy, where does it come from? We never did that.
I actually have in a way it recurs, but in a way it builds on what you just said. It dawned on me, and I remember exactly in 1991 that everything was performance. And once that dawned on me, then I had the problem of authenticity, which it seems like we no longer acknowledge that would be a problem. And so given that I have no choice but to perform, we all perform, et cetera, et cetera. And I began to realize, that there weren't, this is in fact part of the ocean that we're swimming in. Then the question is, well, how could I perform the real me as opposed to, some me that that is fashioned in advance for what I want to get, or what I, aspire to, or what I'm not but would like to be. That was the most pathetic one, because I began to realize that I had pretended to be what I wanted to be instead of being what I was. And so now I've got this whole slate of authenticity issues in front of me, and I also recognized by about 2000 that was ridiculous. That the authenticity issues were that's a dead end. And so then you don't have anywhere to go. And so I feel like Pierre Schlag at that point, so I arrived at about 2000, and I realized that the authenticity issue and trying to perform what I actually am is a complete waste of time, because you're constantly self-undermining. It's like, is that what I really feel? Is that what I really think? And you begin to realize there's no answer to questions like that. So part of the reason that, like Robert, I'm looking for an alternative, unless I'm looking for an alternative, is that you still have to perform. And so if authenticity is just crap, then what am I supposed to do? Right? Well,
Yeah, sorry.
So I am worried about it.
Yeah, let us try to wield the critique of normativity, I guess, as productively as we have wielded our rationalizations and justifications for this humanist subject, right? Let us try to, in moments where things feel stuck, let us try to bring the anxiety to the surface, or let us try to remember the critique, so that in moments where we feel like we're at an impasse, something kind of gives way feelings wise for a moment. That's what I have noticed myself doing with it, not consciously like as a strategy necessarily, but there are times when my own life personally seems so laden with high stakes consequences and values or traps of the system that I can't escape, like needing to have a job, or, like I taught in the public schools for almost 20 years. So that, there's a lot of institutional norms that are there, of course. And so at times, remembering the critique of normativity helped me to say, okay, a lot of what's going on around me is actually meaningless justifications of some BS that is violent and destructive. So if I'm having feelings of unfairness, a lot of that is predicated on the system, right? Or the tradition, or whatever referent you want to use there. And so I have used it kind of to relieve the pressure of daily life, I guess I would say, because occasionally you just have to throw up your hands and say, means nothing, stuck here, totally useless, right? And there's a certain, this is why movements that are about unreason have always appealed to me. Artistic movements, philosophical movements, surrealism has been very important to me in my life. The reason some of these movements are valuable is because they poke holes. Their values may be limited or may seem to burn out quickly, like punk rock or the grunge movement, or surrealism. Maybe these things don't last very long as artistic movements because no alternative, tradition is valuable, reason and systems are valuable, organization is valuable, maybe because our instincts don't let us escape too much the daily practical reality of our lives. But I find it useful to remember much of what Schlag has said when I need to relieve the pressure on a thing I can't get out of.
I've had to invent several times, and I'll bet you have too, sort of new modes of performance. In other words, I have to take on something I've never done before as a mode of performance in order to get out of, like running for office would be a good example. That's a completely new mode of performance. And you just left a career as a public school teacher, and you're moving into what I take would be a new mode of performance, right?
Yeah.
So do you feel like an imposter at first, or
No,
no?
no. It's the system that's the imposter. It's not me.
Yeah.
I mean, my day-to-day feelings are genuine. That's not to say authentic, because you're right. In a world where everything is performative, authenticity doesn't exist. And I'm very comfortable saying there's no such thing as authenticity. That's a concept that I've been dealing with my RuPaul work for a very long time. There is no such thing as an authentic self, right? But I do have feelings day to day about the work that I do. And I do have beliefs in certain values that I use to negotiate those every day. And they're common beliefs, things about truth and justice and rightness and the Constitution and just the predictability of daily life and hour upon hour. I vote progressively. I donate to progressive causes. I used to get up in the streets for those causes, even at the time when I was reading all this stuff about normativity. And, is there a performative contradiction, as they say? Yes, of course there is. But the beauty that I have found in the Critique of Normativity is that we are all engaged in performative contradiction on a constant basis. And if you can't see that, good for you. Your contradictions are working for you more easily than mine are working for me, maybe,
Yeah.
But what helps me blow off steam of the anxiety of those contradictions and of being trapped in systems I can't control, financial systems, political systems, whatever, is the critique. It just points a finger at the absurdity of our predicament. And I think that there's a lot of value in just letting the kettle blow its top for a minute. But for those who have a lot of certainty in their systems and don't view their life as performatively contradictory, the critique does create a lot of anxiety, and it lets you know immediately who's on what side of that line, I think, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Robert, you had something?
I was just processing what Megan just said. What comes to my mind is, I think most of us would agree the universe is not teleological. There's no goal. We're now agreeing that it's hard to define. There's an ontology from which we emerge. So if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we're going. I mean, it seems to me we're left exactly what you've been talking about for the last hour and 15 or 20 minutes is so much contradiction, so much confusion, so much apathy, so many compensations, etc. I don't know what the measuring device is. What's the stick? Maybe I'm still looking for that. Maybe there isn't one, but I need it to guide my life, to guide my decisions.
Yeah. Each of us is going to invent whatever pleases us to the extent that the system allows us to do that, right?
But I think some of those inventions are lethal and some are positive and constructive. And I try to go by a principle which is contributing to the flourishing of humankind. And so, that to me is correct and right in the direction I want to move in. And I use that as a kind of a point, a goal that I can justify what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I don't feel any conflict about that at all. Mm-hmm. So maybe what we're saying is, well, we must all create our own meaning in that regard, regardless of what the rest of society is saying and doing.
Yeah, I mean, the question is good for who and to what extent, right?
Yeah.
I had this history teacher in high school who he said many hilarious things that were often inappropriate things, like all good advanced history teachers do, right? Yeah. But one thing he would say is don't forget now, Nazism was really good for Hitler until he died in a ditch covered in petrol, right? Now he didn't die in a ditch covered in petrol, he was shot, but still the point is there, right? Any value system can be justified by someone if you just limit the scope of it enough to have an understanding of what one person's ideology might be, right? Right. And so, what's good for you or your household or your neighborhood or your state or your nation or your planet might not be good for somebody else's planet.
And that's the conflict we've got going on in our society right now. I mean, it's what are the prime values of this society? What we're ripping ourselves apart in that argument.
Yeah, because in the end, no one knows.
Yeah, in the end, no one knows.
And that's the critique of normativity.
Yeah.
That sounds like the end of the lecture right there. So thank you, Megan, for everything. And this was fascinating and fun. So I appreciate it. I wish your residence had been real instead of virtual. But what is real anyways?
Yeah, and truly.
It's real
You got the
enough.
best part of me anyway.
Yeah. All righty. So this will be up on YouTube in a week or two. And I thank everybody for attending and look forward to future events. There's nothing coming up immediately. The next thing is a residency lecture by Mikołaj Wisniewski, and that'll be the end of September. All righty. So thanks, everybody.